Respect isn't owed by uniform. It's earned, in silence, when no one is looking. What would you do if someone judged you by your seat before your story? Let us know in the comments section below and stick around to see how this one unfolds. Captain Derek Madsen checked his watch as he crossed the jet bridge toward Gate B12. He wasn't late, not technically, but being early was something he prided himself on. Born into a family where punctuality was next to godliness and aviation a family creed, Derek had never once missed a flight. His jaw was clean-shaven, his pilot wings shined like a mirror, and the epaulets on his shoulders caught just enough light to command attention without trying. He loved this part, the walk, the slow struck through terminals, the heads that turned. Kids whispered to their parents, teens gave casual glances, flight attendants offered small nods of respect. It was the uniform, the authority, the certainty. For Derek, flying wasn't just a job, it was identity. Legacy. His father, Colonel Madsen, had flown fighters in Vietnam, and then commercial jets afterward. Derek followed in those contrails like it was destiny. What Colonel Madsen never earned in medals, he made up for in rigid expectations, and Derek carried them like invisible gear strapped to his shoulders. As he passed the lounge windows, he saw the jet waiting, sleek, ready, Boeing 737-800. No delays, no issues. He liked control. He liked when things went by the book. That's why, when he saw the man seated alone in first class, something flickered across his face. Just for a moment. A pause in his steps, almost imperceptible. A twitch of the brow. See to it. The man was already seated, slim, tall even as he sat, with a posture that looked oddly practiced. He wore a modest charcoal suit, the kind you only see on older gentlemen who remember what tailoring used to mean. A simple cap sat in his lap, not a baseball cap, but one of those classic flat caps, dark navy with a slight curve at the bill, skin deep brown, lined hands resting neatly on a cane. Derek had seen the manifest earlier, no VIPs, no military boarding codes, no high-profile names. Yet, here was this man, an older black gentleman, not speaking to anyone, not even on his phone, just sitting there with eyes that watched everything and said nothing. "Excuse me, sir," Derek said, with the faintest chill of formality in his voice. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man looked up, calm as a windless sky. "Two, eh?" he said, tapping his boarding pass with a slender finger. Derek didn't even glance at the paper. "I mean, this is first class. Did you get assistance boarding? You're not listed for pre-board." The stewardess passing behind caught the tone, the hesitation. The man blinked slowly, then offered a small smile. Not annoyed, not defensive, just quiet. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Derek caught the question and found it unsettling, not because it was hostile, but because it wasn't. It was just too level, too rehearsed. "No, of course not," he replied, managing a tight grin. "We're just double-checking. You know how things can get mixed up these days." The man gave a slow nod and leaned back. "Indeed. Systems make mistakes. People, too." Derek paused longer than he should have, then gave a stiff nod and moved down the aisle. He didn't see the young woman seated in 2C raise her phone slightly. Didn't hear the soft click as she began to record. Andrew Granger turned his head slightly, eyes tracking the cabin ceiling as if studying its architecture. He adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a silver eagle nestled in gold, then returned to stillness like a statue that had chosen, briefly, to move. In the cockpit, Derek sat down in the left-hand seat, powering through the standard preheat checklist, but something had wedged into the back of his mind. That face. That voice. He swore he'd seen it before. Somewhere. Meanwhile, boarding finished with the usual shuffle of business suits, restless children, and carry-on warriors. Jamie Collins, the woman in 2C, had tucked her phone away, eyes flicking back and forth between the video and the man beside her. She didn't speak, But something about Mr. Granger's expression, the stillness, the weight of it, made her feel like she'd just witnessed something. As the jet taxied out toward the runway, the sky above Los Angeles stretched pale and endless. Derek pulled his headset on, but even the hum of the engines couldn't drown out the question floating in the back of his thoughts. Who was this man? He didn't know it yet, but the answer would follow him far beyond 30,000 feet. And for the first time in years, Captain Derek Madsen would have to confront what he'd never learned in flight school. The altitude of character is measured by how you treat someone when you think they have none. The UMZ engines provided a rhythm steady as a metronome as Flight 2289 reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt light dimmed with a soft chime, prompting a familiar shuffle. Passengers reaching for headphones, lifting armrests, unwrapping tiny bags of pretzels like crinkling paper promises. In first class, the mood settled into polite silence, broken only by the occasional throat clear or flick of a magazine page. Jamie Collins watched the man next to her, unsure why she felt the need to. He wasn't doing anything. Wasn't reading. Wasn't sleeping. Just sitting there, hands folded, eyes closed. Not asleep, but elsewhere, like he was listening to something only he could hear. She glanced down at her phone, still open on the paused video she'd quietly recorded during boarding. A 10-second clip, just enough to show the exchange. The pilot's slight sneer, the man's calm response, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. There was no raised voice, no shouting match, but something about the power dynamic, about the way it shouldn't have happened, clung to the video like static. Jamie wasn't even sure why she filmed it. Reflex, maybe. A modern instinct. She'd started capturing little moments like this over the last few years, snippets of injustice, small and large, posted online where the crowd might make sense of it. She hit save, just in case. A flight attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, her posture polished and efficient. When she stopped at row 2, her professional tone kicked in like muscle memory. "Welcome aboard. Would you care for something to drink?" Jamie smiled and ordered a ginger ale. "And for you, sir?" the attendant asked, turning to the man in 2A. He opened his eyes, and there was something unexpectedly sharp in them. Not cold, not even harsh, just alert, like a blade that's been sheathed for years but never dulled. "Coffee," he said simply. "Black?" The attendant nodded and disappeared without fuss. Jamie considered breaking the silence between them, then hesitated. She wasn't sure what she would say. "Hey, sorry the pilot treated you like a trespasser." It sounded ridiculous in her head. Instead, she cleared her throat. "Coffee's better up here," she offered, with a casual smile. "Well, better-ish." He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her. "I've had worse," he replied, and for the first time, Jamie noticed the southern drawl in his voice. Not heavy, just hinted, like something he didn't wear on his sleeve. "I'm Jamie," she said. "Jamie Collins." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Andrew Granger." She smiled. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Granger." There was a pause, and then he added, "Likewise." The flight attendant returned with their drinks. Mr. Granger thanked her with a quiet grace that didn't sound rehearsed. He held his cup gently, warming his hands with it. Jamie, emboldened now, ventured a little further. "Sorry to be forward, but I saw what happened when you boarded." He didn't respond right away. He took a sip, then rested the cup on his tray table. "People see what they expect to see," he said at last. Jamie nodded slowly. "Huh?" He saw an old man. Not someone who belongs in first class. "He saw what he's been taught to see," Andrew replied. "That's the harder part." Jamie leaned back in her seat. "You handled it well. I would have lost it." Andrew gave a small smile. "I've had practice." She caught the weight of that phrase, but didn't press. There was something about his presence that made silence feel not just acceptable, but earned. In the cockpit, Derek was still unsettled. He'd run through the checklist, set the autopilot, briefed the crew. All of it second nature. But the image of that man in 2A kept nudging at him. He finally turned to his co-pilot, a younger aviator named Mark Trenholm. "Hey," Derek said. "Did you catch the manifest?" Mark blinked, glancing at the screen. "Yeah? Nothing unusual. Why?" Then 2A. "Something about him." Mark tilted his head. "What about him?" "I don't know. Just thought maybe we had a retired general or something on board. He carries himself like someone." Mark shrugged. "Maybe." "Didn't recognize the name. Want me to look him up?" Derek hesitated. "No," he said. "No, it's fine." But it wasn't fine, because something had clicked in the back of Derek's mind. A fragment. A memory. Years ago, during simulator rotations and training, there had been a quote written on a whiteboard in red marker. One of the instructors had left it there. "The moment you stop learning, you're dangerous in the sky." Below it, a name had been scribbled in small block letters. Granger. He hadn't thought of it in years. Could it be the same? He opened the cockpit door briefly and poked his head into the galley. "Hey, Mindy," he said to the lead flight attendant. "Any idea what the full name of the guy in 2A is?" She blinked. Granger. "Andrew Granger, I think. Why?" "No reason," he said, ducking back into the cockpit with a knot forming in his gut. Granger. It couldn't be." "Could it? Could it?" He opened his iPad quietly, pulling up the airline's intranet, tapping into the alumni directory of their military transition pilots. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, maybe to prove himself wrong. But there it was. Andrew Granger, USAF, Ret. Master Sergeant, Flight Instructor, Strategic Airlift Command, 30 years of service. Trained over 600 pilots. Distinguished Service Medal. Final assignment, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. Derek stared at the screen for a long time. The coffee he'd poured earlier was now cold. He felt something lodge in his throat that wasn't ego, not quite shame either. More like gravity. That man, he questioned? That man had probably trained half the officers in Derek's own airline. Hell, for all he knew, Derek's instructor might have learned from Granger. And he'd treated him like someone who didn't belong. Back in first class, Jamie leaned in a little. "Mr. Granger," she asked, "if you don't mind me asking, were you in the military?" He nodded once. 30 years. "What branch?" "The Air Force?" She smiled. "My uncle was Air Force. Cargo planes, C-17S. Andrew took a sip of his coffee. "Good aircraft. Did a lot of hours in those." Her eyes widened. "Wait, you flew them?" "I trained the ones who did." Jamie blinked, then let out a breath. "Wow, that's incredible." He gave a small shrug. "Just did my part." But Jamie could see it now, in the way he sat, the way he scanned the cabin, always alert, always centered. And Derek? Derek was still staring at the screen, unsure how to face a truth that didn't show up on passenger manifests. He'd flown thousands of hours, logged countless miles. But in the quiet corner of row 2 sat a man who had charted courses long before Derek had touched a yoke, and suddenly Derek realized something else. He hadn't just misjudged a man. He'd disrespected a legacy. The seatbelt light flickered back on, followed by the familiar voice of the captain over the intercom. It was controlled, clipped, almost bored-sounding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some light turbulence over the Rockies. Please return to your seats and fasten your belts." Jamie noticed the slight change in the tone. Most passengers wouldn't, but after what she'd seen, she picked up on it. It was subtle, almost cautious. not the usual detached authority. Andrew Granger didn't flinch. He was already buckled, one hand resting lightly on his cane, the other cupping what remained of his now cold coffee. His eyes weren't closed this time. They were fixed out the window, the sun beginning to descend toward the curve of the earth. Jamie followed his gaze and said nothing. A gentle shudder passed through the cabin as the aircraft began to meet the predicted chop, but it was nothing serious. Just a reminder that even in the sky, nothing is ever fully still. In the cockpit, Derek Madsen hadn't said much since discovering Granger's file. The control yoke in front of him might as well have been a steering wheel made of gilt. The airspace was clear, their route was precise, but the atmosphere inside his chest was stormy. Mark, the co-pilot, glanced sideways. "You good, Cap?" "Yeah," Derek said too quickly. Then, quieter, "Yeah, just thinking." Mark waited a beat, then turned back to his instruments. It wasn't like Derek to hesitate. He was sharp, no nonsense, a by-the-book operator. But this wasn't in any book. No checklist told you how to course-correct for a mistake you didn't realize you'd made until it was broadcast through someone else's eyes. He'd seen enough pilots crumble under pressure, stall-outs in simulators, panicked trainees, overconfident rookies, but none of that had prepared him for the moment when his own instincts proved faulty. He tapped the intercom button again, then let it go. What could he say? Sorry for being condescending? Turns out you trained half my mentors? Derek pulled the manifest up again and stared at the name. Andrew Granger. The letters looked different now. Back in first class, Andrew shifted slightly in his seat. The motion was minimal, but Jamie noticed. His breathing had become a bit slower, more controlled, like someone counting the seconds of a drill. "Sir?" she said gently. Andrew's eyes returned to her. "You okay?" He nodded once. "Just doing what we always do." Jamie tilted her head. "What's that?" "Reading the air." Another brief rumble of turbulence passed through, enough to make a few heads snap up in coach. Andrew didn't move. "You'd be surprised how much the body remembers," he said after a moment. "Even when the job's over, your spine stays tuned, your hands don't forget how to brace. There's a rhythm to flight. You feel it, or you don't." Jamie watched him with quiet awe. "Is it strange being a passenger instead of a pilot?" she asked. Andrew chuckled softly. "Depends on the pilot." It made her smile, but it also made her glance instinctively toward the front of the plane. He caught it. "I'm not angry at him," Andrew said. "Not really." Jamie didn't answer, unsure what to say. "Everyone thinks dignity is some kind of shield," Andrew continued. "But it's more like skin. You can't take it off. You just learn how to carry it, even when people try to tear pieces of it away." A sudden ding interrupted them. The flight attendant returned, checking on passengers. She paused at 2A. "Mr. Granger." He looked up. "I have a note from the cockpit," she said quietly, extending a small slip of paper. "The captain asked me to deliver it personally." Jamie watched him unfold the paper slowly, his fingers precise and steady. It was brief, handwritten in clean block letters. "Sir, if you're willing, I'd be honored to speak with you when we land, Captain Madsen." Andrew looked at the note for several seconds, then folded it again and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said. The attendant nodded and moved on. Jamie leaned in. "You think he means it?" Andrew gave a small smile. "He's flying this plane through air I've seen 100 times. The only difference is he doesn't know yet how close he is to growing up." Jamie studied his face. "You talk like a teacher." "I was, but not in classrooms." A voice broke in, an older man in 3A, across the aisle, leaning slightly forward. "Sorry, I don't mean to eavesdrop," he said, a bit sheepishly. "Did you say Andrew Granger?" Andrew turned toward him. The man blinked. "Well, I'll be damned. You trained my brother-in-law. Back in '89, Scott McCarthy. He said you were the sharpest instructor he ever had." Andrew gave a slow nod. Scott flew C-5S. Good man. Jamie's mouth opened slightly. You really did train hundreds of pilots, didn't you? Andrew just said enough to remember the names that mattered. Further back in the cabin, a flight attendant whispered to another, and word trickled like vapor in the fuselage. The guy in 2A? He trained Air Force pilots. For decades. Jamie's phone buzzed. She looked down. Her video, uploaded privately just minutes ago, was already climbing in views. Comments rolled in fast. People asking who the man was. Others commenting on his poise. Someone wrote, "That's what grace under pressure looks like." She locked her screen and looked back at him. You know this is going to blow up, right? Andrew glanced out the window again. I've flown through worse storms. In the cockpit, Derek turned the page in his flight manual without really reading it. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. Screwed up, he finally said aloud. Mark blinked. Come again? Emanated the guy in 2A, I assumed. Something, I didn't ask, didn't listen. Mark kept his eyes forward. You gonna say anything? I left a note, asked to talk after landing. Mark nodded. That's a start. Derek nodded too, but it didn't feel like a start. It felt like penance. He looked out the glass, clouds breaking below them, the ground thousands of feet away, and yet, somehow, he felt closer to it now than ever. In row 2, Jamie leaned forward. Mr. Granger, do you regret not wearing your uniform? He smiled at her, not with bitterness, but with a kind of weathered warmth. People don't need to see the cloth to feel the weight behind it. Besides, uniforms can be taken off. Character can't. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked on again. They'd begun their descent. Jamie tapped her chest lightly, near her heart. I think you just taught me something I'll never forget. Andrew looked at her, then slowly nodded. Good. That's all I ever wanted from the pilots I trained. Not perfect landings. Just people who knew the sky belonged to everyone who earned their wings. And with that, Flight 2289 began its slow, steady drop back to Earth, carrying more than just passengers. It carried perspective, and Derek Madsen, for the first time in years, realized he wasn't just landing a plane. He was about to face something far more humbling. The landing gear thumped down beneath the fuselage with a sound every experienced flyer recognized. Not just the mechanical click of engagement, but a kind of promise. Earth was near. Home, maybe. Or reckoning. For Andrew Granger, it didn't matter where the wheels would touch. Atlanta, Denver, Seattle. It was all tarmac and schedule to him. What mattered was what stayed in the air long after you landed. As Flight 2289 dipped under the cloud ceiling and the skyline peeked out in the distance, Jamie watched Andrew out of the corner of her eye. He didn't flinch at the descent, didn't brace. He sat with his hands calmly folded over the cap on his lap, like someone who had already landed thousands of times before. The cabin remained quiet except for the usual clicks of tray tables being locked into place, safety briefings murmured by attendants, and the subtle collective hush that fell over people realizing they were returning to Earth. In the cockpit, Derek Madsen's jaw clenched as he gripped the yoke, not out of stress, but out of something more internal, more difficult to name. Guilt didn't quite fit. Regret was too soft. It was more like the taste of having failed his own standard and knowing there wasn't an easy landing for that. Runway 2L confirmed. Wind southwest at 9, Mark said beside him. Derek gave a short nod, almost forgetting he had to respond. Copy that. He guided the plane through the approach, every instinct mechanical and smooth. His hands were steady, his face was unreadable, but inside he felt like every breath was a kind of reckoning. Mark didn't speak again. The silence said enough. A soft bounce, the mild squeal of rubber meeting concrete, and Flight 2289 was down. The plane taxied toward the gate, slow and deliberate, and while the wheels rolled forward, time seemed to hang suspended. Andrew didn't move. He knew when to stand and when to wait. He'd taught a generation of pilots that patience was not weakness but precision, discipline with a purpose. Jamie watched the man in 2A as if trying to memorize him. The lines on his face weren't hardened. They were etched like calligraphy, written with thousands of quiet hours of resilience. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, the rustling began. Bags shifted, arms reached overhead. The dance of departure. Andrew didn't rush. Jamie stood and reached for her carry-on, then paused. "Would you like help with anything?" He smiled. "No, thank you, but I appreciate the offer." She nodded. He rose slowly with dignity, gripping the cane in one hand and his cap in the other. His back straightened, revealing his full height. He was taller than he looked seated. Thinner, too, but not frail. There was a kind of anchored strength in him that made those around instinctively make room, even if they didn't know why. As they shuffled toward the door, Andrew paused in the galley, just behind the curtain that separated cockpit from cabin. "Would you like to step off first, sir?" the attendant asked politely. Andrew smiled gently. "I believe the captain requested to speak with me." She blinked, then nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. One moment." In the cockpit, Derek unbuckled his harness and pulled off his headset, hearing the movement behind the door. His hands were dry now, but his pulse ticked against his neck like it was tapping for attention. He stepped into the narrow galley and saw Andrew Granger waiting, eyes calm, shoulders squared. They faced each other in silence for half a breath. Derek broke it first. "Mr. Granger." Andrew gave a faint nod. "I wanted to apologize," Derek said, words slow and deliberate. "For earlier. My approach, my words, they were out of line." Andrew tilted his head slightly. "Because I was in first class?" Derek swallowed. "Because I made an assumption, based on appearance. That's on me." Andrew didn't respond right away. He watched the younger man, as though gauging whether the apology was about duty or understanding. Then he said, "You're a pilot. I assume you know what happens when you misread conditions on approach." Derek nodded, quietly. "You lose control of the aircraft. You misjudge altitude, overcorrect. Sometimes it's recoverable, sometimes it isn't." Derek met his eyes. "You're right. I was wrong." Andrew nodded slowly. "It's not the mistake that defines you," he said. "It's what you learn from it." There was a pause, just enough time for both of them to feel the gravity between those words. "Sir," Derek said, "I found your name in our veteran database. I didn't realize who you were." Andrew offered a wry smile. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. The words didn't sting. They landed like a truth Derek had been waiting to hear. "I've trained over 600 pilots," Andrew continued. "Some of them went on to become generals, some flew cargo, some left flying behind entirely. But the ones I remember, they weren't the ones who got the smoothest landings." Derek looked up. They were the ones who owned their mistakes, learned, grew, and taught the next one in line how to do better. "I'd like to be one of those," Derek said. Andrew's smile deepened just a touch. "And make sure the next person you speak to doesn't have to prove they belong where they already are." Derek nodded, and for the first time it wasn't just acknowledgement. It was gratitude. They shook hands, not a quick grip and go, but a firm, deliberate shake, between peers. Andrew stepped past him, walking down the jet bridge with a calm that carried more weight than any uniform. Passengers parted slightly as he moved forward, not because of recognition, but because something about him, something unseen, commanded it. Jamie waited near the terminal window. She lifted her phone briefly and lowered it again. She didn't need to record anymore. "Hey," she said as he approached. "Everything all right?" Andrew smiled. "Yes," he said. He landed the conversation better than the plane. She laughed, then paused. "There's already thousands of people watching that video. People are asking who you are." "I'm nobody special," he said. "Just a man who gave his life to the sky." She reached out her hand. "I'm glad I sat next to you." Andrew shook it. "I'm glad you listened." And then he turned toward the terminal exit, cane tapping softly against the tile, a rhythm all his own. Behind them, Derek stood just inside the gate, watching. Not as a captain now, not as someone in command, but as someone learning what real altitude meant, measured not in feet above sea level, but in the grace it takes to own your flight path. And for the first time in his career, Derek understood. Some lessons don't come from manuals. They come from men who flew long before you and still know how to navigate without making a sound. 2 days later, a video clip, exactly 10 seconds long, had ignited a fire across social media platforms. No dramatic music, no narration, just a simple moment. A commercial airline captain quietly questioning an elderly black man seated in first class, followed by that man's dignified, unshaken response. That was all it took. Jamie Collins hadn't expected it to go viral. She hadn't added hashtags or flashy titles, just posted it with a single caption: "This is what dignity looks like when it's tested." But by morning, her inbox was flooded. The clip had crossed over 1 million views, and Andrew Granger's name was now echoing through corners of the internet that usually ignored men like him. Veteran forums picked it up first, identifying him almost immediately. Within hours, old Air Force colleagues were leaving comments, tagging one another. "He taught me back at Maxwell. Granger taught my commanding officer. Legendary flight instructor. Did you hear how he handled that pilot? That's Granger, all right." Always led with calm. The video spread to mainstream media next. Morning shows debated it with the same breathless urgency usually reserved for celebrities and scandals. But this was different. There was no outrage machine being fueled here, no one yelling into a camera. It was just quiet power. A man who didn't have to raise his voice to make the entire country listen. And listen they did. The airline couldn't ignore the storm. PR statements came quickly, first defensive, then conciliatory. A spokesperson acknowledged an incident on board Flight 2289, calling it a moment of misjudgment not reflective of our values. But those words meant nothing until they were followed by action. Jamie watched it all unfold from her apartment in Chicago, phone buzzing every few minutes, each ping another notification, another comment, another request. She refused interviews, kept her identity quiet. This wasn't about her. It never had been. But when she saw a message from someone named Alyssa Kim, Director of Veteran Relations for Monarch Airlines, she paused. The email was short and personal. "I'd like to speak with you about Mr. Granger. We're reaching out to him directly as well, but if you're willing to help connect us or provide more context, we'd be grateful. We want to do this right." Jamie read it 3 times. Then she opened a draft and simply wrote, "He's not hard to find, you just have to listen." That same day, Andrew Granger sat at his kitchen table in Montgomery, Alabama, the same place he'd sat every morning for 20 years since retirement. His home was modest but clean. His walls held framed photographs, not of him, but of squadrons, airfields, patches, and one faded black and white picture of a much younger Granger standing beside a transport aircraft, arm around a young pilot who'd later become a general. He sipped his coffee, same as always, and glanced at the newspaper someone had left at his doorstep. A folded copy of the Montgomery Advertiser, with a headline just below the fold: "Retired Air Force Instructor Becomes Internet Symbol of Dignity After Airline Incident." He exhaled slowly. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sigh. The phone rang. "Mr. Granger?" A woman's voice, clear, professional. "Yes. My name is Alyssa Kim. I work for Monarch Airlines. First, I'd like to say thank you. And second, I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to meet with us." Andrew said nothing at first. "Then, are you calling because people saw a video?" A pause. "Yes," Alyssa admitted. "But not just because of that. We want to hear your voice, not defend ours. Another silence. I don't do speeches. We're not asking for one. Andrew nodded to himself, then gave her the name of a diner near the base. Nothing fancy, nothing public, just a quiet table. He agreed without hesitation. 3 days later, they sat in a booth beneath the hum of overhead fans and the scent of old coffee. Alyssa was younger than Andrew expected. Mid-30s, Korean-American, with eyes that showed she didn't come from corporate PR. Not originally. She came from something else. Service, maybe, or family that had served. Andrew ordered eggs and black coffee. Alyssa had tea and a notepad she didn't open. "Mr. Granger," she said, "there's been a lot of internal conversations since the incident. We've spoken with Captain Madsen. He's taken full responsibility, no excuses." Andrew didn't nod. He just waited. "He's requested to meet with you again, not for the cameras, just one-on-one, but only if you're open to it." Andrew finally looked up from his coffee. I already heard what he needed to say. "We understand. But if he's asking because it helps him, that's not a reason." Alyssa met his gaze. "He's asking because it changed him. There's a difference." That made Andrew pause. "We've also decided," she continued, "to establish a new training initiative. It'll be mandatory for all senior flight crew, focused on cultural humility, veteran recognition, and situational respect." Andrew raised a brow. Situational respect? The idea that respect shouldn't be conditional on what you see or think you know. It should be automatic. He sipped his coffee again. "Sounds like basic decency. But if you need a seminar to teach that, your problems run deeper than protocol." Alyssa smiled, not defensively. "Agreed. But culture changes one person at a time. One crew at a time." She pulled a small envelope from her bag and set it on the table. "This is a formal invitation. We'd like to name the initiative after you, the Granger Standard, to stand as a model for how we treat passengers, veterans, and, frankly, people." Andrew looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "What happens when the internet forgets?" he asked. Alyssa shook her head. "Real stories don't need to go viral to leave an impact. They just need to be remembered by the right people." Outside the window, jets traced distant lines across the morning sky, contrails like fading echoes of paths once flown. Andrew looked out at them for a long time. Then he said, "You can use my name, but only if the people saying it remember why it matters." Alyssa nodded slowly. "We will." They stood, no handshake, just eye contact, mutual understanding. As Alyssa left, Andrew lingered behind. He placed a few bills on the table, adjusted his cap, and stepped outside. The air smelled like old magnolia and the distant rumble of flight. On his porch that evening, Andrew sat with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the sun dip below the tree line. No interviews, no press. Just a quiet acknowledgement from the world that, for once, it had paused long enough to see someone it usually overlooked. And in the silence, something extraordinary had taken flight. 3 months passed. The video had long since stopped trending, replaced by newer controversies, viral dances, and the daily churn of online noise. But not everything faded with the scroll of a timeline. Some things dug in, quietly, like roots. Andrew Granger didn't check the internet. He didn't need to. He measured his days by the rhythm of the coffee maker, the slow arc of the sun across his kitchen window, and the soft creak of his porch steps as the mail arrived. Fame meant little to a man who'd spent his life making other people excellent. But change had arrived anyway. But not all at once, not loudly, but in pieces, like puzzle corners locking into place. One morning he opened his mailbox and found a heavy envelope, postmarks from Monarch Airlines headquarters in Dallas. Inside was a handwritten letter, rare these days, and a laminated badge tucked into a leather folio. The letter was from Elisa Kim. Monsieur, Mr. Granger, I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to be the first to see the final version of what we talked about. Enclosed is your honorary crew badge, issued under the Granger standard. It will be displayed in every major terminal our airline serves. The policy that bears your name is now part of our training modules, our corporate onboarding, and our flight school partnerships. But more importantly, it's being lived by people. We didn't build a statue, we rewrote the rules. With respect and deep gratitude, Elisa. The badge was simple, dark navy, gold trim, his name printed cleanly beneath the monarch crest. It wasn't a token, it was a symbol, an apology made permanent. Andrew held it for a long time, his thumb brushing over the raised lettering. For a man who never asked for recognition, the weight of it struck somewhere deeper than pride, somewhere closer to memory. He thought of Sharon, his late wife, her voice in his head. Don't ever let them forget what you gave, Drew, not for medals, but for dignity. He smiled softly and placed the badge in his coat pocket. That same week, Monarch Airlines held its first Granger Standard Leadership Seminar in Washington, D.C. Flight crews, new captains, and airline executives gathered in a quiet conference center, where the keynote speaker was not a motivational guru or a CEO. It was Derek Madsen. He stepped onto the stage not as a man defending a title, but as someone who had finally understood his own flight plan. He wore his uniform, but there was no vanity in it, just presence. He told the story, not with dramatics, not with spin. He told the audience about a quiet man in seat 2A, about the mistake he made in a moment of unconscious bias, about what it taught him, not just as a pilot, but as a person. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked once when he said, "Respect has altitude. It's either beneath you or above everything else." At the end of his talk, there was a standing ovation. Derek walked off stage, not toward applause, but toward purpose. He wasn't trying to atone anymore. He was trying to build. Back in Montgomery, Andrew's life didn't change much on the surface. He still went to the same diner twice a week, still wore his cap when he walked, still helped coach the local ROTC on Saturdays, offering flight sim insights to wide-eyed high schoolers who'd never sat in a real cockpit. But people noticed him differently now, not with fanfare, but with reverence. One afternoon, a young Air Force pilot named Daniel Romero walked into that same diner. He was tall, Hispanic, freshly pinned with captain's bars, and carried himself with a kind of nervous energy that Andrew recognized instantly. "Sir," Daniel said, approaching Andrew's booth, hat in hand. Andrew looked up. "I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For everything. My instructor back in tech school was one of yours. Said you taught him how to fly with his head, not just his hands. That you taught with silence more than lectures." Andrew smiled. "Sometimes silence makes room for people to hear their own instincts." Daniel nodded. "They're naming a new training hangar after you at Maxwell, the Granger Pavilion." That gave Andrew pause, not because he needed the honor, but because that name meant something had truly landed. "I used to train kids in those hangars," Andrew said softly. "Now they're training each other." Daniel hesitated. "Would you come visit the base? I think it would mean a lot to all of us." Andrew considered it, then looked out the window, where a C-17 thundered overhead in the distance, its wings cutting the sky like old memories coming home. "Then I think it's time." 1 month later, Andrew stood once more on the tarmac of Maxwell Air Force Base. He walked slowly beside Daniel, cane in one hand, wind catching the edge of his cap. The air smelled of jet fuel and sunburnt concrete. The sound of turbines whined in the distance. He watched a group of cadets practice maneuvers, their formation crisp, their eyes filled with purpose. One of them turned toward him, just a glance, and nudged another. In moments, half the line had gone still, recognizing him. Not for fame, not from the internet, but recalled his name had made its way through the ranks the old-fashioned way, through stories, through tone, through example. Daniel guided him inside the new Granger pavilion. On the wall hung a plaque. This space is dedicated to MSGD. Andrew Granger, USAF, a man who taught us that altitude is more than numbers. It's integrity, it's quiet, and it's earned. Beneath it was a framed image of Granger in his youth, smiling beside a massive cargo plane, one hand on the fuselage like he could feel its heartbeat. Andrew didn't speak for a while. When he did, he said simply, "That plane never left the ground without knowing the person flying it understood the weight they were carrying." Daniel looked over. "That's why we need your story. For the ones coming up." Andrew nodded. "Then let's make sure they hear it for the right reasons." Outside, cadets formed up, and as Andrew stepped out, the commanding officer called, "Attention on deck!" Dozens of young airmen snapped to attention, not because he asked for it, but because respect, when earned, ripples forward like lift under a wing. Andrew Granger removed his cap, and for the first time in many years he saluted, not to a superior, not to a flag, but to the future. Because in a world so quick to judge and forget, his stillness had spoken volumes. His grace had become policy, and his name, once nearly overlooked in a seat labeled 2A, now soared as a standard carried forward. In the end, Andrew didn't need headlines or speeches. He just needed people to remember. Sometimes the loudest changes come from the quietest men, and sometimes the world's most important flights begin with someone finally seating the man, already seated in first class.